We now come to the backbench debate on proportional representation for general elections, and I call Alex Sobel to move.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I beg to move this House considered proportional representation for general elections. Before I speak about the matter of hand, I would like to note that today is the funeral of one of my party's and our country's greatest politicians, John Prescott, and send thoughts to his family and friends, including some who would have been with us today, but are of course there, and equally some of us that are here that would have been there. I thank the Backbench Business Committee for granting time in the Chamber for this crucial debate, and to the very many colleagues from across the House and from every nation and region in the UK who co-sponsored or supported the application. It is right that the House should give time to consider proportional representation for general elections to this place. Just last month, this place voted in favour of PR for the first time ever, passing the first reading of the 10-minute rule bill on the subject moved by the member for Richmond Park, who I see is in her place. That historic vote was an indication of strength and breadth of feeling from colleagues on both sides of the House that our first past the post election system is not working and is desperately in need of an upgrade, and we need to seriously consider the alternatives. The last time we did this was through the Jenkins Commission in 1998, when elections produced results where seats more closely matched votes than they do now. My hope for today, one I know many others share, is that members can explain why so many colleagues and so much of the public at large have reached the conclusion that it's time to think again about our electoral system. And in doing so, I want to encourage the government to be bold, to be honest, about how unrepresentative British general elections have become. And take
my friend give way on that point?
Of course.
I thank my friend for making a powerful speech and opener on this. Does he agree with me that turnout at the general election last year in July dropped to below 60%? That means 2 in every 5 people didn't even participate. Does this not show that actually we need to change that so that more people engage in our democratic system?
Absolutely. The turnout and engagement of voters in general elections should be a matter of concern for everybody in this place and at the country at large. The truth is, first past the post is failing on its own terms. It's becoming less and less representative and producing more and more random results. More outliers, more MPs elected on less than 30% of their constituents who votes. So in reality, some MPs represent constituencies where maybe 85% of those who they represent didn't vote for them. These are the lowest figures since universal suffrage. The numbers don't lie and can no longer be ignored. The public knows it, our parties know it, and we in this place know it. And these growing failures represent democracy, the widespread feeling that ordinary people don't have a fair say over who speaks for them or how they are governed, are feeding the record low levels of trust in politics and faith in democracy. That should worry all of us. The government has a responsibility to face up to those problems and address them before the next general election, starting with the launch of a National Commission for Electoral Reform. The 1997 government were brave enough to undertake this work at a time where confidence in the electoral and political system were much higher and less stressed than they are now. But let me begin with looking at last year's general election. Most people got neither the party they voted for in government nor the candidate they voted for as their local MP. Labour won a historic majority, and I travelled around the country working in many constituencies where we needed to get the votes to win those marginal seats. And so it's been for Labour MPs in seats perceived as safe, like mine, in the living memory of all party members, probably of all parties. But this speaks to the failure, not the success of our system. The 2024 general election was a culmination of years of falling vote share for the winning party, where we, the Labour Party, won on just 1/3 of the national vote. Now, I always work extremely hard for my party to be in government, of course, and I'm delighted that almost 10 million people voted for us. However, 19 million people who voted for other parties, who we must admit are the vast majority of those who took part in the election, they did not get to influence the kind of government the country has. Can no longer be acceptable to have a winner-takes-all culture on 1/3 of the country's vote. This erodes our democracy. One of the arguments supporters of first-past-the-post elections is you aren't really voting for a government, but just for a local MP. Well, let's take this at face value. Only 4 out of 10 voters got the local MP they voted for in the last election. 4 out of 10 got their MP, 6 out of 10 didn't get the MP they voted for. We have a system that ignores that 6 out of 10 people. We're now in an unprecedented situation in which 554 MPs, 85% of us here, were elected with less than 50% of the voters who turned out to vote. I'm one of the lucky few who received over 50% of the vote. So this debate and the change I'm proposing is not of personal benefit to me. And 266 MPs, 41%, were elected with less than 40%. There are even a few colleagues, I'm not sure there are any in the room today, who are elected on less than 30% of the vote. 30% of the vote. When most people can see their representation in Parliament doesn't reflect how they voted, it feeds the all too pervasive sense that Westminster is some distant, unresponsive institution, one that voters have no real voice in. Like all the first past the post elections, 2024 was one in which some votes in some areas mattered more than others. When the system forces parties to prioritise small groups of votes in a handful of marginal seats, it also forced them to neglect large parts of the country, in terms of who we speak to, both directly and through the media, and the policies we put forward. People in non-battleground seats, who make up the majority of seats at every first-past-the-post election, never have the level of resources spent on them as that of marginal seats, and candidates and activists are directed away from those perceived safe seats to marginals, meaning less contact in the election in those seats. This is usually reflected in the turnout of safe seats against marginal seats, as voters are generally well aware of the relative importance of their constituency. It is hugely corrosive to our trust in politics, and we end up with most people and most communities up and down the country saying they feel, and I quote, invisible to politicians. This is the words that the Brown Commission used, invisible to politicians. People can tell when they're being ignored. They can also smell unfairness a mile away. First past the post means people's votes are not equal in value. I sometimes fear that we in this place are used to this level of gross unfairness in elections, and that we have become numb to it. But for millions of people, their stake in national politics is the vote they get to cast in a general election every few years. And when they see a party who won 2 million votes get 4 MPs, or a party who won 4 million votes get 5 MPs, it's clear to them the system isn't fair. It drives voters into the margins or from voting at all. If we in Westminster are really content to say, that's just the way it is, then it's no wonder hardly anyone trusts politics.
Would Murray Frank agree on that point?
Sure.
He may be aware that an aptitude poll from the Electoral Commission in 2023 found that more people were dissatisfied with our democratic election system than they were satisfied. If we are to look at changing our current voting system, does he think this would help more people feel satisfied with our voting system?
Sobel.
Thank you. I'm coming on to those exact points shortly, so I'd like to thank my honourable friend for raising them, and I will address them at that point in the speech. But just say the last general election was a stark illustration of the problems with our voting system, but it's important to understand that it wasn't a one-off. The 2024 general election wasn't a one-off. These problems have been getting worse for decades, and they're set to continue to get worse if we keep the system as it is. We've gone from 97% of people voting for the Labour or Conservative parties in the 1950s, just 58% doing so in 2024, a record low. When this happens in the first past the post system, it produces hugely volatile and erratic results. Electoral chaos theory, as Professor Rob Ford has called it. Back in the mid-20th century, parties needed close to 50% of the vote to win a majority of seats, but this threshold has been falling to new lows for decades. 39% in 1974, 35% in 2005, and as I said, 1/3 last year. And there's every reason to think this trend will continue. When a party, even an extreme party, can win a huge majority of less than 1/3 of the vote, it's not just senseless, it's dangerous. If we don't address this now, I fear we're going to see electoral results become even less representative, with governments and MPs elected with lower support than ever, and increasingly chaotic and random results. And this will only drive trust and engagement still lower. This is unsustainable, and I think the government knows it is unsustainable. Labour's official policy on first past the post, and I quote from the final National Policy Forum document the party produced in the last Parliament, the one that set the policy platform for our manifesto. It stated, the flaws in the current voting system are contributing to the distrust and alienation we see in politics. I, of course, agree. and almost all the parties on the other benches also agree. We also know the public agrees. 2/3 of the public want the flaws in the voting system addressed before the next general election, according to Survation. The long-running British Attitude Survey found record and majority support for changing to PR, with those who trust politics least the most likely to support change. Aren't they the people that we really need to engage? Just this month, YouGov found support for PR hit an all-time high, with support for first past the post an all-time low. Indeed, I can tell the House that every single MP in Great Britain has been contacted by constituents in recent days asking them to support PR in this backbench business debate. I've received hundreds of emails, even though my name is on the debate. The Prime Minister has made clear that restoring trust in politics is a key priority, calling the fight for trust the battle that defines our age. If the government is to win the battle, it must address our flawed voting system. A voting system it knows is driving distrust and alienation of politics. A voting system that means millions of people's votes don't count. A voting system that most people don't want to continue with. That's why I urge the government to take this first step by establishing a national commission for electoral reform, as recommended by the APPG for Fair Elections, which I chair. The government has said there's no consensus on a new system, but that's exactly why there's a great opportunity for it to set up a process that begins to build consensus. A national commission could examine the issues first past the post is causing and recommend a fair and democratic alternative.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way, and he's making a good case, one that I fundamentally disagree with, as you'll hear later, but a very, very good case. Can I just ask the honourable gentleman, he's outlining his own government's position on proportional representation. We've already had an answer, and I just want to ask him where he thinks he can now go, because on the 2nd of December 2024, when asked by the honourable gentleman for Didcot and Wantage, the Deputy Prime Minister said that this government would not set up a national commission and would not examine proportional representation any further. So what does he propose that he will now do to see that the government might change their minds?
Alex Sobel.
Well, I think I just said that it would be the first step for the government to set up a national commission, and I think this debate is the first step for the APPG to work with and try and persuade the government to set up that national commission. So, you know, we're all on a journey, and not everything the government announced at the start of the Parliament is still what it's announcing. Change is possible. Change is possible.
We're elected on change.
And right, I'm just going to conclude my speech now. The Commission could draw insights from the experience of devolved bodies and other democracies. It could allow citizens, as well as experts, to really contribute to evaluating the options and finding a way forward that would command public trust and confidence. None of this need distract from government's core mission of delivering its manifesto priorities, but it would demonstrate, beyond doubt, that the government is serious about giving a stronger voice to millions of people who feel increasingly excluded from British politics. Thank you.
The question is, as on the order paper, and I call Marie Goldman.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. When I was out knocking on doors in my Chelmsford constituency in last year's general election campaign, lots of people reminisced with me about a previous general election where the Liberal candidate came just 378 tantalising votes short of the incumbent Conservative. They spoke very fondly of that candidate, which might not be so surprising, apart from the fact that that election, the one that they were recalling, was in 1983, over 4 decades ago. I also remember speaking to an elderly, lifelong Labour voter who was lending me his vote for the very first time because, well, he had to do something different. When I thanked him for placing his trust in me, he told me not to take too much from it. You see, his entire life he'd never voted for a candidate who'd won. I think I'll always remember that conversation. Well, we'll see about that, I said as I walked away. You see, until last July, the constituency of Chelmsford, in its various shapes and sizes over the years, had never been represented in Parliament by anyone other than a Conservative for 74 years. In fact, it had been 100 years since Chelmsford was last represented by a Liberal, something I'm now extremely proud to have corrected. But the point is that it shouldn't have to be this way. I hugely admire the tenacity of that erstwhile Labour voter who lent me his vote, hoping against all the evidence of his lifetime that this time his vote might make a difference. But honestly, no wonder turnout in elections is often so painfully low. Our antiquated first-past-the-post system can be incredibly demoralising. Even for a committed political campaigner like myself, believe it or not, I really don't actually like having to ask people on the doorstep to lend me their vote, so that together we can game the system and get the change that we want to see. Wouldn't it be better if people could cast their vote in a way that let them set out their preferences, to know that all wouldn't be lost for them if their first preference candidate didn't win, that their vote could be transferred to someone else, that they also wouldn't mind seeing elected? Turnout in last year's general election, as has already been alluded to, was 65.9% in Chelmsford, slightly better than the national turnout, which was a pretty poor 59.7%. In Manchester Wrexham, the turnout was just 40%. But these are dizzying heights compared to the turnout in local elections. Barely... I will give way.
I appreciate what she's talking about. Well, she's talking about a preferential voting system rather than a proportional voting system. So does she understand there's quite a big difference between those two options she's putting forward? And obviously today's debate is around that proportional representation.
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his intervention and his question, but I don't think those two things are mutually exclusive. I think there are preferential systems which can lead to proportional results. So, and in fact, we see those in other places, in many places, in fact, which do use preferential systems. But if we should refer to the election in May 2024 for Essex's Police, Fire and Crime Commissioner, where the turnout was barely 25%. So why aren't people voting? Surely part of the issue is at least that they simply don't believe that their vote counts. They don't believe that they can make a difference. And while I don't completely agree with that, I certainly agree that first past the post makes it harder. And there are other things that also make it harder. And I don't think we should be talking about changing our voting system without also talking about the other things that make up our electoral system that contribute to making things harder. And one of the things I would point to is voter ID. The introduction of voter ID was supposedly designed to enhance trust in our elections, but the evidence suggests that there have been some other consequences. In the 2024 general election, 4% of people who didn't vote said the voter ID requirement was the reason they couldn't. Additionally, 0.08% of those who went to the polls were unable to cast their ballot because they didn't have the correct ID. Now, these may seem like small figures, but if we put those into rough numbers rather than percentages, with about 28.9 million people casting their vote, the number of people who showed up but couldn't cast their vote because they didn't have the correct ID was approximately, unless I've got my maths wrong, 23,000 people. 23,000! That is an incredibly high and quite shocking number. Just think about that for a moment. So 23,000 people couldn't vote because we wanted to stop voter fraud. But of course that might be a good idea if there were lots and lots of voter fraud going on. But according to the Electoral Commission's website, their own website, it says, and I quote, "In the past 5 years, there is no evidence of large-scale electoral fraud. Of the 1,462 cases of alleged electoral fraud reported to police between 2019 and 2023, 11 led to convictions, and the police issued 4 cautions." Talk about a sledgehammer to crack a nut. Voter registration is another area where improvements are needed. Research shows that as many as 8 million people across the UK are not registered correctly at their current address. This affects key groups, such as young people, private renters and recent home movers who may not realise they're missing from the register until it's too late. While the current system allows for late registration before elections, this puts unnecessary pressure on electoral services and risks leaving some people unable to vote on polling day. So we can see the impact that even small barriers to voting can have. Imagine what would happen if we broke down and got rid of those barriers. I believe we must recognise that barriers to participation, including voter ID, voter registration, and of course the voting system itself, are dangerous to our democracy. I urge the government to take the opportunity to fix this and thereby to strengthen democracy and democratic engagement in our country.
Eve Race.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'll be very brief in my remarks in this debate in order to not repeat arguments already made by honourable members from across the House in such a good style. I also just do want to have the opportunity to put on my record my support for electoral reform to ensure that the composition of our representatives better reflects the wishes of voters and that voters are able to exercise more choice. The Labour Party has a long and proud history of supporting these objectives of proportionality and choice in other legislatures across our United Kingdom and, of course, in other elections. elections. Until recently, of course, voters were able to offer a nuanced view utilising the supplementary vote system in mayoral elections. Sadly, that level of choice was rescinded by the last Conservative government. As the Honourable Member for Chelmsford pointed out, this is just one of the steps taken by the party opposite in their Elections Act 2022, alongside the introduction of the need to show identification when voting, which has left many people feeling locked out of voting altogether. Of course.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. One of the other changes put forward by the previous government in that Elections Act was the changes to postal votes, which, again, has disenfranchised so many people. Does he believe that if we are going to look at electoral reform, we should look at some of the changes and some of the consequences caused by the last government?
I absolutely agree with that, and as I was just about to move on to, whether it's the iniquity of allowing the older person's bus pass but not the young person's bus pass, or else leaving out entirely the ability to use a veteran's ID card or a train driver's licence, for example, the Act, I think, was largely unnecessary and introduced many retrograde measures that are designed to restrict access to our democracy rather than encourage participation. I'm pleased that... I will.
I thank the honourable gentleman, and I have a lot of respect for him. He says that the last bill actually restricted people from their ability to vote. Can I therefore ask him what measures he would bring in place which would stop the restricting of genuine voters from voting when their vote is taken away by voter fraud?
Thank you very much for the intervention. I think, as has already been pointed out, the level of voter fraud in this country was minuscule. Exactly. Well, it's not that it's okay, but it was we have introduced legislation that essentially restricted many, many more people from voting than otherwise would have been the problem. Can I make some progress? Thank you. I'm pleased that this government has legislated to allow use of the veteran ID card, and I would ask that they look at a wider range of suitable ID, including train driver licences, in any future review. But preferably, Madam Deputy Speaker, we would return to the traditional British approach of not demanding ID in order to have access to a vote. On the issue at hand, I want to recommend to colleagues the outcome of the Jenkins Commission of 1998, which has already been referenced, which designed an elegant solution to the issues our democracy faces when it comes to representation. Jenkins, one of the great social reformers of this place, to whom many of us still owe a great debt of gratitude, proposed a hybrid system which kept many of the benefits of first past the post, such as the strong relationship that an MP has with a defined and manageable area, but with additional proportionality through the additional member system. Constituency MPs would be elected through the AV system in addition, in order to add choice into the system as well. Versions of this system are now in operation for elections in the Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Senate and the London Assembly, so this isn't theoretical and voters understand it perfectly well. Proof that a Labour government can and does deliver much needed social reform and always has. Madam Deputy Speaker, while I do not support electoral reform in a pure PR sense, I also absolutely accept that politics is about priorities. And this government has a huge task to do, three things all at once, I believe, not something many governments have ever faced before. We must stabilise our public finances, we must get the economy growing in a sustainable way, and we must rebuild our public services. This is a mammoth task, but it is what the public demanded when they elected our party with a landslide last year. So I can well understand that these take priority over time for electoral reform. I don't think I could look my constituents in Exeter in the eye if I knew we were spending much time, and it would be much time, in this place discussing how to be elected rather than addressing their immediate concerns. And as I mentioned before, there is much to do that can be fixed to make the current system more democratic and accessible. And I do support my honourable friend's call for a commission into this issue in order to find a way forward. So while I remain an electoral reformer, I do also welcome the government's current focus on supporting the development of a stronger economy, grabbing the opportunities that are on offer for my region and delivering jobs and investments in places like Exeter, while also working hard and legislating hard to fix our roads, end our homelessness and housing crisis, clean up our waterways and rebuild our health system. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
And Thomas.
It's an honour to sit on the APPG for fair elections, which is so well chaired by my honourable friend for Leeds Central and Headingley. It's also an honour to take up this fight in this House with the Liberal Democrats, for whom electoral reform has been a central tenet for decades. In order to be here today, Madam Deputy Speaker, I had to resign my commission in the Royal Air Force, where I had for 23 years defended our country and our interests overseas. But I came to recognise that the most crucial way to defend our democracy was to do so here, whilst backing proportional representation. Throughout the 2024 general election campaign, residents across Tewkesbury constituency frequently expressed their frustrations with an electoral system which was certain to condemn them to another 5 years of the same Conservative Member of Parliament, whichever candidate they voted for. Tewkesbury had been represented by my predecessor for 27 years, and the view of many residents was that Tewkesbury would never experience change because our broken electoral system would see this safe Conservative seat won for an 8th consecutive election. I'd love to.
Isn't his presence in this House actually demonstrating the fact that the system actually does work and can deliver change on an individual basis?
I thank the honourable member for his intervention. No, it doesn't, for two reasons. First of all, the Liberal Democrats defied the odds. Actually, there are many other smaller parties that are not adequately represented as they might be. And as I'm coming to later, 58% of voters across the country did not get the MP they voted for, and that's even true in my constituency. At the general election, Tewkesbury did see change, but only through the coming together of several unique circumstances, despite first past the post, and because, like my honourable friend from Chelmsford, I was loaned the trust of Labour, Green and Conservative supporters. The general election may have been won by Labour and returned Liberal Democrats in record numbers, but let us not delude ourselves. The country voted tactically in record numbers for whomever would remove the catastrophic, nepotistic and morally bankrupt Conservative government of 2019. July's election brought the briefest respite before once again frustrations rose. This is the most disproportionate House of Commons in British history, with Labour MPs in 66% of seats, but with the lowest vote share of any winning party since 1945, 34%. As I told my honourable friend from across the bench, 58% of UK voters did not get the MP they voted for. I've previously described first past the post as barely democratic, and these figures vindicate me. Public apathy toward politics is reflected in a steady decline in general election turnouts since the 1950s, from over 80% of voters to less than 60% in 2024. If we want to arrest this decline, people must feel their vote matters. The only way to ensure that the next election returns a representative parliament is to transition our electoral system to one of proportional representation. I've occasionally been challenged that proportional representation would increasingly return hung parliaments and lead to bickering and chaos rather than functioning government. This challenge falters when presented with the previous government and its 80-seat majority, elected through first past the post. Never in the field of British politics was so little achieved by so many as they scrambled from controversy to controversy, fighting amongst themselves whilst undermining our institutions and allowing our public services to crumble. Today, our friends in the United States are living the inevitable result of its two-party system, as far-right populists have seized the previously conservative Republican Party, neutered the media, and dismantled many of its institutional safeguards. We must recognise that we face the same threat, as our Conservative Party, the most successful election-winning machine on earth, continues its lurch to the right and brings fringe opinions into the mainstream. It can happen here, and we must have a fair electoral system in place to mitigate against it. Liberal Democrats were elected in record numbers in 2024 on a pledge to deliver proportional representation. Labour members want proportional representation. The public increasingly wants proportional representation. So I bid the government, Let's come together and do something historic. Let us put aside our individual and our party political interests for the many. Let's do the right thing. Let us change our country for the better and deliver proportional representation.
Andrew Ranger.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to take part in this debate today on what I believe is a subject fundamental to fixing the foundations of our country. It's worth repeating, public trust in our political system is in a state of crisis. Fewer than 1 in 3 Britons now believe that the UK is a well-functioning democracy. And we should be clear, as other members around the House have said, this is not something that has happened overnight. It's a consequence and a reflection of a political system that is outdated, broken and in desperate need of reform. This has led to a steady decline in general election voter turnout, with 2024 being the second time in history where it fell below 60% since the year 2000. And it hasn't been above 75% since 1992. Even the Brexit referendum only got 72% turnout. So it's not a great endorsement of the systems we've had so far. And even more concerning to me is that we've got a recent survey of 25% of people aged 16 to 25 stating a preference for a dictatorship, which I think is astounding in place of our current representative democracy, because they don't believe the current system delivers and that their voices are not heard. Of course I will.
I thank my honourable friend for making a passionate speech in support of this, and something that I've long supported, and I know there is cross-party support, is reducing the voting age to votes at 16. Does he believe that if we actually gave young people a say, by exercising their right at the polling station, they wouldn't have some of these views because they feel engaged and involved in the political process?
Thank you. I thank the honourable member for that intervention. Yes, and I absolutely agree, and I will come on to that a bit later. So they don't believe the current system delivers and their voices are not heard. And these statistics should be a concern to us all, regardless of political persuasion. And it's clear that the status quo has got to go. Out of 43 countries across Europe, 40 have proportional representation of some kind. And when we look at places such as Scandinavia, we can see that voter turnout regularly exceeds 80%, a level we haven't achieved since 1950. 3 of these 43 countries, as has already been said, are found in the UK, with Scotland, Northern Ireland and, of course, Wales, having operated a form of PR since devolution back in 1997. And in Wales, our next set of elections next year will move to a full PR system, which I fully support and campaigned for. The Welsh system shows that rather than something to be feared about, PR actually enhances our democratic system. Voters can head to the ballot box knowing their chosen party will receive fair representation in accordance to how they perform. And now it's time that Westminster follows suit. It cannot take 2 more decades for the Commons to catch up, at a time where trust in politics and politicians is at one of its lowest ebbs. The introduction of proportional representation is a crucial step in rebuilding that relationship. I do welcome the measures that the Labour government is currently taking to try and rebuild trust, making it easier than ever to register to vote, embarking on significant House of Lords reforms, a devolution revolution and a clear intent to clean up politics for good. But for me, this is fundamentally an argument about fairness, that everyone's vote should be equal and everyone's vote should count. So surely with a huge commanding majority, now is the time to be bold, be brave and introduce proportional representation. And the first stage of this would be establishing, as has already been said, a National Commission for Electoral Reform, so that the government can get on the front foot and show it is serious about addressing our unrepresentative voting system, stem the rise of disengagement and distrust. This would be an opportunity to bring the public, as well as experts, into a conversation about how voters are best represented and propose a fair and equal voting system fit for modern Britain, where everyone's vote and voice counts.
Tice.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, as we've heard in this chamber, trust in politics is so important for a functioning democracy. But sadly, based on the statistics and the data, trust is collapsing. Because we face the lowest turnout at the last general election, I think the second lowest turnout in the last 100 years, with just 6 in 10 people voting. And what does that tell us? That tells us that far too many people don't think that voting matters. Whereas I hope we can all agree that every vote matters. And that's why I pay tribute to the excellent work of the lobbying group Make Votes Matter for proposing and promoting this. It is so important. How can we have a situation where only 6 in 10 are voting? I think, Madam Deputy Speaker, we have the most unrepresentative Parliament in living memory. We have a situation where the governing party has about 34% of the votes cast, but 63% of the seats in this great House. What sort of system is that? I mean, it's completely unrepresentative. So you lead to a situation where my good party, we had 14% of votes cast, and yet we have not even a mere 1% of the seats in the chamber. And other smaller parties, the Green Party, they have, I think, just under 7% of votes cast, and about 0.5% of votes in the chamber, or just over. This is so damaging to trust in democracy. So we have 823,000 votes cast for reform per every single seat. And the Labour Party, a mere 23,000 votes for every single seat. I still have voters coming up to me saying, how does this work? And then people get confused because, as other honourable members have said, well, we've got this system for the general election and we've got a different system in the devolved nations. Which one? Why can't we have a simple, single system that we know works, that is used, of course, in so many democracies around the world, a variant of proportional representation? And what it leads to, Madam Deputy Speaker, not only is a misrepresentation on the seats in the House, but because of the quirks of the system, it means that we have no representation on any single select committee, despite having 4 million votes and 14% of the votes cast. Trust in democracy collapses if something is so patently unfair as that. And it is so important. And we know we can do better. I think it's marvellous that honourable members from the government party, the Labour Party, recognise this. Indeed, in their conference recently, a couple of years back, they actually passed, I believe, a motion to that effect. Fairness is absolutely vital, Madam Deputy Speaker, because if not, what then happens is that in terms of this misrepresentation, you have also a complete misrepresentation of the views of the people on critical issues like immigration, like net zero, because you end up with a sort of uniparty type approach. And that cannot be good for democracy. If people feel, well, all of our views, you can't be represented, so what's the point of bothering? I'm just going to carry on my own life. Whereas actually, we all know that more engagement from so many people of all ages, young, medium, and old, is vital for a functioning, true democracy. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Luke Akehurst.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I thank the honourable members who have secured this important debate. This is a subject I've been debating outside this House for, unbelievably, nearly 40 years, so I've had some time to assemble my thoughts on it. During that time, I've often seen people argue for or against proportional representation or first past the post based on what might be the immediate advantage of their own political party. I would urge against such an approach to questions about democracy and electoral systems. One benefit of engaging in this debate for so long is that I've been able to see the political cycle change over time, so that an electoral system that might benefit a particular party at one point may work to its disadvantage at a later stage. The party that gets a massive boost in seats from first past the post in one election may get a disproportionate kicking from the electorate in terms of the seats that the system delivers in another. The volatility of the modern electorate makes that particularly pertinent. The core bedrock support for either major party is a far smaller group of voters than it ever used to be, and demographic and political change is accelerating that. No party, mine included, should think that the current coalition of voters they have assembled is here to stay, and that they should therefore design their preferred electoral system around maximising the number of seats that its current coalition of voters can win. Yes.
Just on that very point then, what is his views on his government's proposal to reduce the voting age down to 16 when we all got elected on an age of 18 and above?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his intervention. I think that's a different subject to the one question. So if the honourable gentleman doesn't mind, I'll proceed with the question about proportional representation. We don't know how voters will behave if they were confronted with a different voting system. We can't say that because Labour got 34% of the vote in 2024 under first past the post, it would therefore have got 34% if the 2024 general election had been rerun under a proportional representation system. Voters do change their behaviour to fit the voting system. There might also be new parties that would grow under a different voting system. Tactical voting in its current form would, and we don't know how many Labour identifying voters back other parties for tactical reasons in particular seats. The honourable lady opposite mentioned voters that had spoken to her about doing so, or how many supporters of other parties voted Labour for tactical reasons, or what the net impact of unwinding those factors would be on each party. I will.
I thank my honourable friend and for his long campaign on this really important issue. Does he agree with me? All of us have probably knocked on doors and we've spoken to voters who said they've never voted because their vote will not count. Does he believe that if we had a different voting system, we'll be able to see that every single vote at the ballot box will make a big difference on who is elected on polling day? Does he share my concern on that?
I thank the honourable lady for my honourable friend for her intervention, and I do share that viewpoint, and I will come to that later in my remarks. We don't know how much turnout would increase in areas where it is now depressed because the outcome under first past the post appears a foregone conclusion. So my honourable friend anticipated the next thing that I was going to say. The current fracturing of the party system, with 5 parties getting more than 5% of the vote, more parties than that in Scotland and Wales, is probably here to stay. That means there are more marginal seats and more free or even four-cornered fights for marginal seats, and more members of Parliament elected on relatively low vote shares by historical standards. Ironically, that does improve voters' range of viable choices in many seats and their chances of influencing the result in a meaningful way, because there are fewer safe seats, but it is trying to pour a multi-party system into an electoral system designed for 2 parties. So it inevitably leads to more and more disproportional results where the relationship between vote share and number of seats completely breaks down. For instance, as has been mentioned, the Liberal Democrats got 72 MPs despite receiving more than 500,000 fewer votes than Reform, who only got 5 MPs. I don't blame the Liberal Democrats or my own party for seeking to maximise seats rather than votes. That's the game that we are supposed to be playing with our current system, but it's difficult to go out to the public and objectively defend such surreal disproportionality, and it increases public cynicism about their ability to influence politics. Therefore, my motivation for supporting a move to a more proportional voting system is not that I think it will provide either an immediate or long-term advantage to the party I've dedicated my life to campaigning for, and I would hope that honourable members of other parties would not be motivated by assuming proportional representation will accrue them immediate narrow party advantage at Labour's expense. On the contrary, as a social democrat, my approach to any political question is based on core principles of social justice, democracy and equality. That leads me to a position of support for a more proportional voting system, just as it leads me to egalitarian and redistributive answers to social and economic policy questions. We should design an electoral system based not on whether it benefits us as individual politicians or our own parties at a specific moment, but on whether it delivers just and equitable outcomes that can logically be defended. Particularly, we should apply the philosopher John Rawls's theory of justice and try to measure what the impact of each electoral system is on the most underrepresented party and the most underrepresented voter, and argue for a system that treats parties and voters as fairly and equitably as possible and gives voters as equal influence as possible over who represents them and who governs the country. All voters... I will.
Mahindra.
He's been very, very generous with his time and making some very valid points. I may not always agree with them, though. Does he believe, then, to ensure that the electorate is fully representative, that we need to go to the Australian model of forcing all constituents to go to the ballot box?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his intervention. I have often looked at the question of compulsory voting. I remember Lord Watson, who's now in the other place, advocated it at one point. I'm open to the suggestion, but I don't think that it's this would basically be trying to force people to vote, when actually what we should be doing is trying to infuse people to vote, both by the way in which we do politics and the way in which the system works. As I was saying, all voters should have an equal value wherever they live in the UK. First Past the Post condemns millions of voters to living in electoral deserts where just one party dominates all the Commons representation. There is no region or nation where this reflects the diversity of the votes cast, and between different regions and nations it can benefit different parties. We need a system that sends a mix of MPs to this place from each region and nation who represent the political diversity and balance there. First Past the Post privileges and makes very powerful a relatively small number of swing voters in a small number of marginal seats, whilst giving very little political power to the majority of voters in safer seats. This distorts our political process. Policies, campaign spending, where politicians visit, where activists travel to, messaging, advertising are all focused on swing voters in marginal seats, whilst elections in some safe seats can be very quiet affairs. When parties are in opposition, First Past the Post makes them narrower based. In recent previous parliaments, when Labour was down to a small parliamentary party, it meant Labour often appeared to be a sectional voice for big cities and university towns, which was unhealthy, even though we had millions of votes but very few MPs in demographically different parts of the country. Now it can mean that the Conservative parliamentary party appears dominated by rural interests, as their votes in urban areas deliver very few MPs. Both situations are unhealthy. Support for proportional representation is now the consensus position at a grassroots level in the Labour Party. Polling says 83% of Labour Party grassroots members support it, and the vast majority of constituency Labour Party members backed it when our annual conference voted in favour of electoral reform. In fact, I think it's the single topic that the largest number of local Labour parties have ever submitted motions on. Mixed member systems are used in places like Germany and New Zealand, and they prove that the undoubted merit of the constituency system, such as having a voice and a champion for a specific geographical area in Parliament and giving voters greater access to us as their local representatives, can be combined with a proportional element, and that this produces stable and effective governments, and I would say produces governments which pursue the social democratic values that my party stands for. I hope, in conclusion, that it will not be too long before this Labour government aligns its stance on our voting systems with our guiding values of equality and democracy.
Lisa Smart.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm a Liberal Democrat. I'm also the Vice Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Fair Elections and a co-sponsor of this debate today. And it is a genuine delight to see members on both sides of the House talking about this issue, which is one of the founding principles of my party. I believe firmly, though, that we're only going to bring about the change that our country needs on a cross-party basis, which is why working with the member for Leeds Central and Headingley, who opened our debate today, and also the member for North Herefordshire, is an absolute delight on the APPG, and I look forward to working with them to deliver the change that we need. Because the case for electoral reform is urgent and undeniable. First past the post is a system that no longer functions as a fair or effective mechanism for translating the will of the electorate into parliamentary representation. It is collapsing under its own weight, and the time has come to take the first step in addressing this failure with the establishment of a National Commission for Electoral Reform. As colleagues have mentioned across the House, the 2024 general election was the most distorted in British history. Labour secured 63% of the seats with just 34% of the vote, while the Green Party and Reform UK won almost 21% of the vote between them and received only 9 seats. Now, I'm going to disagree with both parties often and vigorously on different issues, but I defend their right to be represented when a number of people vote for them. These results do not constitute fair representation. They represent a systemic failure. The consequences of such an electoral mess are huge. The Electoral Reform Society has shown that 58% of those who voted in 2024 ended up with an MP they didn't vote for, and 85% of MPs were elected with under 50% of the vote, myself included. It now takes, as others have mentioned, 24,000 votes to elect a Labour MP, but 824,000 votes to elect a Reform UK MP. Broader trends confirm the growing inadequacy of first past the post. According to the IPPR, voter turnout has fallen from 84% in 1950 to below 60% in 2024. Trust in politics is at an all-time low, and a system that continues to distort electoral outcomes so significantly will only worsen this crisis. With pleasure.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. Trust is so important in politics. We all know that, we recognise that, and we are responsible for building that trust. One way we build trust is being accountable, and the system we have at the moment gives us accountability to our constituents within the defined area, our constituency. How would first past the post help build that accountability of a named person, a single MP, to that defined area?
Well, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady for intervening. I think her question was probably how would PR deliver accountability, not how would first past the post deliver accountability. But I very much agree with her that accountability and that constituency link is really, really important. I'm really glad that this debate hasn't nerded out excessively on which is our favourite form of PR, but there are many systems operating indeed within the United Kingdom in the different nations that deliver that constituency link. I very much agree with her that that's an important part of our democracy. PR provides a clear alternative to what we're currently doing. It ensures that seats broadly match votes, that every voter has a meaningful say, and that governments represent the majority of the electorate. And we already have proportional representation in the UK, just not here in Westminster. In Scotland's Parliament, 93% of voters have at least one representative they voted for. And in Westminster, that figure stands at just 42%, according to the Electoral Reform Society. PR is already used in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland in different forms, as well as in the vast majority of democracies worldwide. So why not here? Evidence shows that PR leads to higher voter turnout, more representative governments and more stable policy making. And for a long time, the question of electoral reform has been viewed as an abstract debate, indeed with people arguing over the Didcot versus STV, rather than one being integral to democratic legitimacy. It's neither sustainable nor responsible to continue governing under a system where a party can form a large majority on barely a third of the vote. It is reckless to maintain an electoral model that so consistently produces such wildly disproportionate groups of MPs and leaves millions of voters feeling ignored. And if these trends are allowed to continue, it's not difficult to see how turnout will fall further, results will become even more distorted, and political instability will grow. Now, I'm a Lib Dem, as I outed myself earlier, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I enjoy speaking with and listening to voters. I'm also a fan of a bar chart on my leaflets. But wouldn't it be I'm delighted to report to the honourable member that my bar charts have been measured and are accurate to the millimetre. But wouldn't it be a joy for all of us? I would be delighted to give way on the subject.
thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank the Honourable Lady for giving way. Would she accept that one of the great advantages of moving to a proportional voting system is that there would be no need to put any bar charts on any leaflets, and it would be highly misleading to put them there, and there would be no two-horse race graphics, and there would be no squeeze messaging, and everyone would be able to vote for the party they really wanted to.
I couldn't have been more delighted to have welcomed the honourable gentleman's intervention, and I wonder if actually he's been listening in to the Hazel Grove constituency Liberal Democrat executive meetings. I agree with him, though, that I'd much prefer, and I imagine a number of voters, when thinking about how to vote, would much rather talk about values and principles and policies rather than a rather grim-looking canvasser pointing earnestly at a bar chart, worried about who might get in if the vote splits. PR would be better for our politics and better for our communities. Madam Deputy Speaker, there is widespread and growing support for change, both here in Parliament and across the country. A National Commission for Electoral Reform would provide the necessary first step towards finally addressing the failures of first past the post. A step that must be taken well before the next general election, because to ignore the urgency of this issue would be to further undermine our democracy. Now, governments aren't always known for doing things that they don't see as being in their best interest, but I would argue, and a number of colleagues across the House would argue, that this is in our whole country's interest, and that's why I urge the government to ask. The public is watching, and the demand for fair representation cannot be ignored forever. Our democracy depends on it.
Yeah. Oh, Jazz Athwal. Oh, forgive me. Before I call Jazz, we've got to get everybody in, so we're going to have a speaking limit of 5 minutes, and I call Jazz Athwal.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I rise to speak, and I really didn't want to upset the camaraderie going across and back and forwards in the chamber, but I think this is debate and this is democracy. So, firstly, I think I want to ask that we're all sure that we can all agree that no voting system is perfect. Instead, we're choosing between imperfect systems. And that is a fact. And it's based on what works best for our country. And PR is not the panacea that everybody is talking about today. In fact, in 2011, we put the question to the British people. Overwhelmingly, it was rejected that an alternative voting system should not be put in place, choosing instead to stick with first past the post.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. I especially thank my honourable friend for giving way. On Monday morning, I visited the Year 10 citizenship class at St Peter's School in Bournemouth, and I spoke with several young people, including Ozzy, who was only just born at the time of the last vote. And he said to me, did I agree with him, that too many people feel that their vote doesn't count. Too many younger people feel like they're disconnected from democracy, and that with the continuation of first past the post, we're going to leave more people, particularly younger people, feeling disconnected from democracy. And I will leave it there.
Thank you. And I think the other thing I would like to say is that when we're over-reliant on statistics, that does say something. And I will come to statistics as well, if I'm allowed. Madam Deputy Speaker, I've had the privilege of living in my constituency for half a century, over 50 years. Incredibly grateful the opportunities that Ilford has given to me. A staunch Conservative constituency becoming a staunch Labour constituency, and I've seen many MPs from both parties, and of course that is how the democratic process works. And like my honourable friends across the chamber, I am devoted to my constituency. Each and every day I serve my neighbours fighting for the investment in Ilford, representing their views, making sure that I speak up on the issues that matter most to all of them. Only last week in this chamber, I raised the issue on the democratic backsliding and the human rights in Pakistan, a subject that is incredibly important to many of my neighbours with friends and families in the region. I'm accountable to the people of Ilford South, and I take my role and my relationship with my constituents seriously. Under a PR voting system, personal local links that I so value with my constituents are lost. PR system makes it harder for local concerns to be represented and addressed. They take politicians away from our communities and hollow out the vital relationships between representative and constituent. The British Academy analysis of closed PR systems suggests that under PR, politicians aren't beholden to their constituents, the tie is loosened and accountability is degraded.
I thank him for giving way. Like the Honourable Gentleman, I come from a local government background. Would he agree with me that when it comes to being a councillor, as he was, the constituents are more likely to vote for individuals rather than parties based on the effectiveness of that individual rather than just the party branding?
I think it's about being pragmatic in your response, being pragmatic with your residents and making the right decisions. And if I was in a coalition, then perhaps, as I will just come on, if I'm just allowed to make some headway because I can see the clock ticking. Another key weakness of PR systems is almost inevitable coalition governments they create, and we know what that's happened. No one votes for coalition governments. Instead, they are created by agreements hammered out in dark rooms behind closed doors. Frankenstein governments which undermine the popular vote. When voters cannot predict the consequences of their votes, when coalitions circumvent the will of the people, when creating an effective opposition becomes an impossibility, that's when democracies fail. Be careful, colleagues, what you wish for. You may get better vote share, better representation, but you may not get the better outcomes, which is what is important to our constituents. It is our duty in this place to protect the democratic process. It's also our duty to effectively govern to the best of our ability, to deliver the promise of our manifesto, and to create the change our constituents voted for. PR systems create unstable governments and with weak foundations and constant compromise. We are all too aware of the consequences of government instability, the impact it can have on people's lives. Promises broken, legislation delayed, injustice prolonged. Look at our neighbours in Europe. Belgium, federal elections in 2019 paralysed their political system. Over 500 days of deliberation, of compromise, of bartering before a government was finally formed. Almost 2 years of debate before a 7-party coalition was created, a coalition nobody voted for. The role of government is to change people's lives, to legislate, to act. Instead, PR systems grind governments to a halt. In contrast, during the first 100 days, you may not like, on the other side of the chamber, the decisions made, but the... In conclusion, Madam Deputy Chair, one of these two tests, effective democratic systems ensure accountability and enable delivery. On these two tests, PR...
Order. Siân Berry. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I would associate myself with the comments of many other honourable members here today, and I thank the honourable member for Leeds Central and Headingley for introducing the debate. It comes at a crucial time when we're in a world characterised by democratic decline and falling trust in institutions. Without public belief in making change through democratic debate, political pluralism and representation from people who listen to them, we have a society vulnerable to being exploited by populist division and tyranny. And first past the post adds to these risks. Those who seek to distort our national conversation from outside pardon me, using money and influence to pursue their own agenda, can see dangled in front of them the huge prize of what is virtually absolute power if they can achieve the slimmest of margins to reach first place in a volatile system where the two-party system, first past the post, assumes, which first past the post assumes is in fact long out of date. Other honourable members have said that the last UK general election was the most disproportionate on record, with 58% of voters not receiving an elected official of their choosing. But not only this, the election was one of the most disproportionate elections to a primary chamber seen anywhere in the world. People are voting in historic numbers for parties other than the Conservatives and Labour, representing different views across the political spectrum and bringing in points of view from across our island's different nations. Yet this Parliament doesn't come close to correctly reflecting that shift. We have a Parliament that is highly misrepresentative of the public's preferences and a government with a huge majority, but only 33.7% of people's preferences. This seems unbalanced and unrepresentative to me. But I'm not here to make arguments that are only in my own self-interest. Proportionality is not the goal here. A better politics is. And it isn't just parties, but minority groups and the interests of groups who might be ignored or face discrimination and who are geographically spread out, whose interests don't often get a fair look in when a large majority in this House is elected by only swing voters in marginal constituencies. Now, I was, for many years, like other members of this House around different parties, a member of the London Assembly, elected under PR to scrutinise and hold to account a mayor elected within a modified AV system. And I came here to this building to give evidence to the relevant APPG of the time in that capacity. I talked there about how, as a London-wide member, working alongside constituency members, my role was often to listen to groups who were not necessarily getting the ear of their constituency member or the mayor, and who were trying to highlight issues that were happening in pockets to people like them all around London. This is not a party... Oh, I will give one.
Thank you for giving way. How would the honourable member explain to constituents about things like casework? As a constituency MP, we all represent a defined area of the population. What she's suggesting there is that she will just sweep up those that the constituency MP, if there is a two-tier system, instead. So does that mean that she's effectively asking for two-tier of MP?
I thank the honourable member for their intervention. Yes, exactly. I am describing the different kinds of work that different kinds of members in the additional member system can do and how that benefits equality and representation. So, yeah, I'm not making a party political point here at all. I think there would be members from other parties in the London Assembly who can give examples of ways in which they've reached out and heard from people in different parts of London who've brought issues to the prominence of the Assembly. But in our case, in the case of the Green Party, we could talk about council estate residents, private renters, young people, disabled people and older people, and the way that bringing their voices into the chamber had a positive influence on the London Mayor's policies, and made him a positive advocate for helping to reduce the number of demolitions, for rent controls, for toilets on the London Tube, and for youth services. This is a really positive way. I'm going to press on because I've got one more point to make, I'm afraid. So I think that shows that there's a contrast here to the current system here for general elections, and people believing that the national politics conversation doesn't necessarily involve them. We find that millions of people around the country, for example, are never ever canvassed. This seems really, really poor for them not to be courted at all on the doorstep, for them to be taken for granted, because as the member introducing the debate said, the members for those seats are called to other parts of the country when they prefer to be knocking on their own doors. So yes, on to solutions. Absolutely, urgently, we need an independent national commission on electoral reform. I want this done by the government as soon as possible. But I also think this commission should look at how local councils and other bodies can be elected too. We have an opportunity now presented by imminent local government reorganisation, the creation of combined authorities and potentially very large councils to shift to a more proportional system of using potentially multi-member wards and a single transferable vote. This is the same system as is used in Northern Ireland and the Republic. It's incredibly simple for voters to cast their preferences. The election counts are extremely exciting, almost like the final stages of Strictly, and it delivers remarkably proportional results. It delivers candidates based on consensus, not division, and importantly, it delivers for many people not only hard-working representatives from the administration, but also people whose job is to listen and represent them from opposition parties. This could help with the potential remoteness of Uber councils, as are being talked about, and I think this should be looked at by the Commission as well, and that, I will end there.
Andrew Lewin.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to start by putting on record that I am a long-standing advocate of a more proportional electoral system for our general elections. My belief is that any system to replace first past the post needs to balance two core features. First, to preserve the vital link between a Member of Parliament and a constituency, but second, to consider a top-up mechanism whereby additional seats are allocated in direct proportion to votes cast. No model is perfect. As my honourable friend from Exeter said earlier on, there's a lot of merit in the system used in Holyrood, in the additional member system. But I don't want the focus of my remarks today to be about the intricacies of alternative systems or even the principled argument for reform in too much detail. Colleagues from Leeds Central, Chelmsford, North Durham and others have already made that case with conviction, and I suspect others will do so later on. I want to focus on how we could build consensus for electoral reform and what time frame is both desirable and realistic. One of the things I think we must avoid is the spectacle of a new Westminster government winning power and then legislating quickly to change the system if they believe it to be in their self-interest. We have seen a version of this in the last Parliament. The Conservative Party had a minority of MPs in London, but legislated in the Elections Act of 2022 to change the London mayoral system back to first past the post, a system that they believe would suit them well. I believe for Westminster elections, nothing would do more damage to trust than if something similar were to happen. Any suggestion that the winner gets to set the rules of the next contest would be dangerous. So where does that lead us? I'm afraid, inevitably, to a referendum. Now, speaking as someone who voted yes to the alternative vote in 2011 and Remain in 2016, it's fair to say I make this case with some trepidation. But I believe it must be made, because if we're to change an electoral system that has been established for over 100 years, I do think it requires a national conversation and a clear and direct mandate from the electorate. This is not a mandate. I don't believe there is a mandate for a referendum in this Parliament, but I do believe there is an opportunity to build one across multiple parties to be ready for the next, and that could be the defining work of the independent commission that's been referenced. 2031 is likely to be midway through the next Parliament. It would also be 20 years since everyone in the United Kingdom was last asked to endorse a change in the electoral system. That referendum was rushed. The alternative vote system proposed appeared to be the first choice of nobody, and I'm afraid for those of us who supported it, its rejection by voters was emphatic. But much has changed in our politics since then. But of all of us who support a fairer system, I believe need to learn from 2011 to seek to build a case for change in a much more considered way. I believe we do have the time to build consensus on the best proportional system for Westminster. Time to make the case within each of our parties that a referendum is the only way to earn a mandate for meaningful electoral reform. Time to propose a date and make the case for it. Now, look, 2031 might seem distant today, but a generation on from the last referendum does strike me as a fair time to ask the question again.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way, and he's giving a typically brilliant speech from when we used to talk to each other in the boardroom of Clarion Housing Group where we worked together. His idea of a referendum is one that's interesting. If a referendum was held and the result was 52-48 to keep the current system, would he expect that the Liberal Democrats would keep asking to put the question again and again and again?
Very grateful. It feels like more of a question back for our in-office chats from a few years ago. I won't comment on the potential reaction of another party, but I will say that I would abide by all referendum results, even though that would be 3-3 and a pretty bad track record for me. But look, I'm serious. I think it's time to propose a date and stick to it. And Madam Deputy Speaker, first past the post has endured for more than 100 years. I believe if we are to convince a majority of the public that a more proportional system will better serve their interests in Westminster, as I do, 6 years is not so long to wait. And despite my track record, I remain optimistic that if we have a referendum, third time round, I can finally be on the winning side.
Olly Glover.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And if I could thank the honourable members for Leeds Central and Headingley, North Herefordshire and my honourable friend and member for Hazel Grove for securing this debate on this important topic. I will endeavour not to repeat the remarks that have been so eloquently made thus far by other members, but I must start by thanking the honourable member for Hamble Valley for him referencing my question to the Deputy Prime Minister a few weeks ago. This is perhaps as close to fame as I will get in this chamber. He is quite right. He is quite right to highlight the fact that the Deputy Prime Minister requires persuasion on this point, and hopefully the eloquent and articulate contributions of colleagues from across the House will help to achieve that and gain her support for the APPG's request for a National Commission on electoral reform. For me, there are three key arguments in favour of proportional representation. The first is that currently there is a clear gap between how people vote and the outcome of the Parliament and thus the government that they get. And people do not necessarily feel invested in the result. And just to address the point made by the honourable member for North Durham, whilst the 2024 general election, perhaps for the first time, was quite a proportional one for the Liberal Democrats in terms of the ratio of vote share to the number of MPs we've got. That's probably been the first time that's happened. And indeed, if I can be perfectly candid, at the risk of incurring the wrath of my colleagues, in parts of the country where we do have more proportional systems, we don't always perform quite so well. So we're certainly not campaigning for this on the basis of self-interest. In fact, it's been a very long-standing Liberal Democrat and indeed Liberal commitment, which I will talk about a little bit shortly. Secondly, the current system is not engaging people with declining turnouts, as has been highlighted. And in 2024, a record low of 58% voted for the two largest parties of Labour and Conservative. And 1 in 3 said they voted tactically for someone other than their preferred candidate or party. And indeed, in many cases on the doorstep, when voters were telling me that they were voting tactically for me, I pledged to commit very hard so that I wouldn't have to ask them to do that again in future. And that is partly why I'm here today.
Will you give way on that point?
Yes, happy to give way.
Thank you. Madam Deputy Speaker, he speaks of low turnout, and I'd be grateful for his opinion as to whether a switch to an electoral system of proportional representation would be to the deficit of any particular parties in this House, and whether that has any reflection in their turnout at this debate. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I thank my honourable friend for his intervention, and there is certainly a clear variation in the representation of parties in the House. But I would agree with other colleagues who have said we don't necessarily know how people will vote when given a more proportional voting system. But that is all the more reason for us to have one, so that people can feel that they can vote with their heart, not with their head, or indeed on the basis of a bar chart of whatever level of accuracy. Thirdly, proportional representation, mine are always spot on, I will emphasise. Proportional representation would also deliver less adversarial and more inclusive and discursive politics, which has the potential to improve policy, governance and tone, things which many people find frustrating about our current system. And parties no longer being able to govern alone with as little as a third of the vote, but in having to do so with others, that is not a problem, that is a benefit of moving to a proportional system. Because governments would represent a majority of voters and would have to work together to represent the various platforms of the parties concerned. The United Kingdom is highly anomalous in retaining first past the post. Very few other European countries do so. And just to address the honourable member's Ilford South points about coalition, I hope he's equally condemnatory of coalitions that Labour has had with other parties in the Scottish Parliament, for example, in the late 1990s with the Liberal Democrats, or needing to rely on minority support in Wales, either of the Liberal Democrats or Plaid Cymru at various times. And for those who scaremonger or worried about the stability of countries with proportional representation, well, let us consider some examples from Europe. The honourable member for Ilford South cited Belgium. Well, Belgium has a better GDP per capita than we do. And if I may defend that nation, which is so often mocked, their only crime really is preferring mayonnaise on chips rather than ketchup, rather than their electoral system. Let us consider Norway, a highly prosperous nation which has made very wise decisions, for example, creating a sovereign wealth fund from its precious oil resources, something that this country would have benefited from had we done the same. Switzerland also has proportional representation and regular coalition governments and has the most punctual railway in Europe, and 100% of it is electrified compared to our derisory percentage in the 30s. And Poland, a new democracy with 30 years of the fastest economic growth in Europe, also has proportional representation and coalition governments. So I put it to colleagues in this House, there is very little we have to fear and a great deal that we have to gain. As I've mentioned, the Liberal Democrats and the Liberal Party, we have called for fair votes for a century, and we continue to lead the campaign for fundamental reform of the electoral system. I will perhaps go where my colleague did not in terms of talking about electoral systems. It is wrong to say that having preferential and proportional systems prevent individual accountability. The single transferable vote system is both highly proportional and critically retains the ability for voters to vote for individual candidates or not, if they choose, which I would agree with colleagues from the Conservative benches is an important principle. Reform is needed to address fair representation in politics and to improve engagement of the members of the public. To not take action would further erode trust in politics and politicians and increases the risk of people voting for more extreme options next time out of frustration with the current system.
Anna Dixon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to thank my honourable friend, the member for Leeds Central and Headingley, for opening this debate so eloquently and for the many excellent contributions that we've heard from across the House. As a member of the Labour campaign for electoral reform and of the APBG fair elections, it's a real privilege to be speaking in this debate. I was recalling how back in the mid-1990s, 1996, I was a United Nations volunteer in Bosnia. It was their first elections after the peace agreement, the Dayton peace agreement. And I was there as a volunteer to make sure that those elections were free and fair. And it was very moving to be involved in making sure that people whose lives had been very disrupted by the ethnic cleansing, to make sure that their postal ballots were received and were counted. And it really underlines for me the importance that everyone should have the chance to vote and everyone have their vote count. And it pains me that here we are in 2025 in Britain and that those things are not true. As we've heard from many members before me talking about the disengagement with politics, and that is, I think, reflected in turnout, that not everyone is voting. And we've seen some of that further undermined by the last Conservative government, as we've heard, in denying voters through the introduction of voter ID. It was also very important for those free and fair elections that there was an independent oversight, the Electoral Commission obviously again having been weakened. And so there are many things that have been undermined in our democracy and leave us in a situation where people do not feel confident that their vote and their voice counts. As we've heard, millions have found themselves unrepresented in this Parliament, with 6 out of 10 people who voted ending up with a local MP that they didn't vote for. We've also been hearing about the extent of tactical voting. So I was elected in a marginal seat up in Shipley. Across the country, we heard 1 in 3 voted tactically. I spent a lot of time on the doors, as the member for Chelmsford herself was saying, persuading people who would otherwise have voted Liberal Democrat or indeed Green that we needed to join together, and please would they lend me my vote. And whilst I'm extremely grateful to all those many voters who did indeed lend me their vote, and for whom I now stand here and represent, and of course I'd love it if they would continue to vote for me at the next general election, but obviously the reason I'm here is because I would prefer, as they would, to vote for their first preference. And I think that's true in marginal seats, but we've also heard today how in safe seats, many people feel disenfranchised and feel it's not even worth voting for the party that they would support because it really won't make a difference. But even those who are voting for the party who is winning those safe seats, they also feel that they're underrepresented, because if you have a very large majority, lots of those votes are still only represented by one person in this place. So for all sorts of reasons, we've found ourselves in a situation where people don't feel their votes count, and this is breeding distrust in politics. Just 12% of people in this country trust political parties. We have to reverse this. People must feel that their voice counts. And it doesn't help when political parties campaign only in marginal seats. So to the benefits of PR, for which I am a strong advocate, I saw as a young adult politics student in Germany how PR led to more stable government. My work in health and social care, I saw governments elected under PR in the Netherlands and Germany pursuing long-term strategic policies on key issues like social care reform, where I know we have much in common across this place. Consensual and collaborative politics. We know the public don't like it, the heckling and the braying, which is obviously common in this place on a Wednesday lunchtime. But some of the best debates have been where we've been in some agreement, the climate and nature discussions, the violence against women and girls debates. With a system of PR, I hope that we would also have better politics. And that's why I support the establishment of a National Commission for Electoral Reform. I believe that the government could get on the front foot, show it's serious about addressing our unrepresented voting system, and stem this rise in disengagement and distrust in politics. We could bring the public with us and rebuild the trust in our democracy. Thank you.
Clive Jones.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I thank the honourable members who have secured this debate. They have brought to this House a very important issue that I and many of my Wokingham constituents care very deeply about. The UK's history of electoral reform is one of slow, gradual change. There is much frustration now in our politics, and I'm sure that very soon this will start to lead to greater demands for electoral reform. British history is full of making the right and necessary steps, only for people on the wrong side of history to decry it as the end of the world as we know it. Examples of this are giving the Catholics a vote in 1829, having a private ballot in 1872, granting women's suffrage in 1928. When we look upon the past, we laugh at how silly the country used to be. Who is to say that the way we view the past now is not the way that our future will view us today? Madam Deputy Speaker, as a young teenager in the February 1974 general election, I was and continue to be filled with frustration and a sense of unfairness with our electoral system. The Liberal Party won 19.3% of the vote, more than half of the number of votes that the Conservatives got, but they won only 14 seats versus the Tories' 297. Under proportional representation, the Liberals would have won 123 seats, the Labour Party 236, and the Conservatives only 240. This obvious unfairness in our system still drives my personal politics today. Madam Deputy Speaker, we need to fundamentally change our electoral system. It is undemocratic that under the UK's electoral system, not all votes count in the same way. First past the post feeds public disillusionment in politics because it leaves millions of people feeling that their votes are irrelevant, just like those in our past, but because of the injustice may not seem as obvious as withholding the right on the basis of faith, wealth or gender. It is essentially withholding the right to vote based on geographic location. So with so many voters now so disillusioned with the first past the post system, will the Minister commit to being on the right side of history and deliver the change in our electoral system that this nation really needs?
Tim Roca.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I thank those who secured this debate? It's a really important issue. And I hope all of us here are committed to the fundamental principle that we're discussing, which is a functioning representative democracy, of elections that reflect the will of the people and endow this place with democratic legitimacy to make laws and to form governments to govern the country in the best interests of the people. And principles are tough, but you have to stick to them. I'm very conscious arguing today in favour of proportional representation of electoral reform, that the natural consequence of the election last year, had there been a different system, would have been more members in the mould of the member for Skegness or for Clacton. But you have to take the rough with the smooth and accept that legitimacy is important and the will of the people should be reflected in the number of seats that parties secure in this place. And members have very ably today talked about the fact that the system that we have currently simply doesn't reflect the will of the people. In our most recent general election, 58% of people who turned out to vote ended up with an MP that they didn't vote for. 554 members of this House were elected with less than 50% of the vote, as was pointed out earlier. And this is a trajectory that is declining. And so the legitimacy of this place inevitably starts to decline as well. Decades ago, parties used to need close to 50% of the vote to win a majority, and we know that last year the government secured 34% of the vote. And it is possible that there will be governments in the future with even less securing of the popular vote. And we've known that this system has been failing for many, many years, and it's been discussed historically, as members have pointed out, a number of times. We had the Jenkins Commission that was referenced earlier, there was a Royal Commission in 1910, there was a Speakers' Conference in 1917, and in fact it was the Representation of the People Act 1918 where we got the closest to reform. We not only secured votes for women, but there was, in the initial draft of that bill, clauses for AV and PR, AV in single-member constituencies and PR in multi-member constituencies. Because, of course, actually, single-member constituencies are a relatively new innovation. For the majority of the history of this place, we had multi-member constituencies. I was looking back, as you can tell, through the history of how PR has advanced in this place, or not, in fact, and I was very taken with an argument made by Herbert Fisher, a Liberal president of the Board of Trade 100 years ago, and he had a very florid way of speaking, but I thought I'd repeat his words today. And he said, "I see before me and around me prosperous and popular heroes of many a stricken electoral field, members who have entered into every home, subscribed to every fund, and by 1,001 processes acquired what is known as the intimate touch with their constituencies, and that it's very natural that such members who have laboriously perfected themselves into the polite art of electoral intimacy should be unwilling to see any change of the system. And it is natural, of course, when you're put in this place by a system, to perhaps be reluctant to see change to that system, which is why we need to be bold and make the case for electoral reform, even though the system we want to replace is the one that got us here. But sadly, a century on, we've made very little progress. So I'm very glad to see the debate that we have today, and I endorse the arguments made for a national commission. And of course, we're so behind other countries in this respect. It's been pointed out that we are in the minority of democratic countries with first past the post. 130 other democracies use PR or a mixed member system. So I hope through this debate, through the hard work of members, continually raising this issue and calling for a commission, we can get to, I was very taken, by the way, by the Honourable Member for Welwyn Hatfield, talking constructively about how we get to a point where we can eventually put something to the people of this country, for them ultimately to make a decision. And I hope that that decision will be to adopt PR, which, in the words of Churchill, is incomparably the fairest, most scientific, and on the whole, in the public interest method to address constitutional injustice.
Rachel Gilmore.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. How we vote and how we select who governs this country is by nature a topic of huge national significance and one that is too often pushed to the sidelines. Madam Deputy Speaker, I have been a member of the Liberal Party and now the Liberal Democrats since I was 17. Fighting for a fairer system of electoral representation is my political mooring, and my party's fight for a fairer democracy for the British people. I am the mother of 4 children. I have one daughter. She is as clever as she is beautiful. Last year, she produced a report into the voting systems across the world. That included Russia, South America, Africa, America, and the European Union, and the voting system here. And she produced analysis which showed incontrovertibly that proportional systems are much fairer for whether you're a woman, whether you're disabled, whether you're from an ethnic minority. So it's not just about the bar charts, it's not just about the figures, it's about real fairness. I might, no, I won't. In the most recent general election, we saw a government elected to power on the lowest vote share for over 20 years, and with the lowest proportion of the electorate supporting this government since 1918. Just 20% of registered voters cast their ballot for the Labour Party. 4 out of 5 electors either voted for somebody else or did not vote at all. One of the so-called merits of the first-past-the-post system is that it is designed to deliver a clean winner, but this is illusory. Reaching back through the annals of British electoral history, 1931 was the last time a governing party in this country secured over 50% of the vote share. The towering majorities secured under this system were delivered not on the basis of a representative vote, but on the quirks and idiocies of a flawed system. When first past the post does not deliver a towering majority, it delivers exactly the sort of instability that it is designed to avoid. Was 2017 an example of a clear winner, where the result led to a strong and stable government? I think the former member for Maidenhead could answer that one for us. For too long, the parties of red and blue have taken the British people for granted. In last summer's general election, Labour and the Conservatives returned their lowest combined vote share in the age of universal suffrage. Yet their combined seats total still dwarfs any and all other parties in this place. 57.8% of voters had to settle for an MP they did not vote for. That includes my constituents. This hardly seems right or fair. The evidence of a broken system is clear for all to see. What on earth has happened to true majority rule? Another argument brought to support this system is its simplicity, Madam Deputy Speaker. I agree that our democratic process should be simple, but what is simpler than actually being able to vote for the party that you believe in, rather than feeling that you have to vote tactically? This system is not fair. It is not proportional. I and my colleagues in my party will continue to fight hard to raise these arguments about unfairness, not because it is a politically expedient thing to do. As it has been pointed out, we did rather well under first past the post at the last general election, but because it is the right thing to do. If anyone's argument against a fairer electoral system is they might disagree with whom the British people vote for, I would ask everyone to consider why they make such an argument, because it is not out of a service to the British people.
Joe Powell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and thank you to all the honourable members that secured this debate. In the general election, like other members have mentioned, we met thousands of voters face to face, and by far the most depressing conversations I had were with the many people who had lost trust in our government institutions, our politicians, and our democratic process. And I absolutely don't think the voters are to blame for that. Part of that was, of course, the last decade of chaotic government, lurching from crisis to crisis, corruption scandals, decline of local services, and that drove lots of people to opt out of this election, with the poor turnout figures that people have referenced, the lowest for 20 years. But I don't think that is just apathy. It's an alienation from our political system that is a fundamental threat to our democracy. And I agree with my honourable friend from Exeter that we shouldn't for 1 minute think that electoral reform alone will solve that issue. The central task of this government is to deliver rising living standards, rising wages, improve public services that will help restore faith in politics and government to deliver on things that people care about. I will give way.
On that criteria.
I think record levels of investment, record rises of wages, fastest growing economy in the European Union, upgrades from the IMF and OECD speak for themselves. But on this issue that we're focusing on today, I do think fixing our democratic plumbing matters too. The Prime Minister said that restoring trust in politics is the battle that defines our age. And I believe that we earn that trust by ensuring that people feel heard and that they have a decision, that they have a say in decisions that affect their lives, and that I'll just make a bit of progress, and that their voice matters. And that is the foundation of my belief in electoral reform. That done right, with appropriate models for different levels of government, it can help to rebuild faith in our democratic system before we end up more polarised, with more alienation that leads to extreme politics and populism. And I agree with my honourable friend sat next to me that today is not the time to go into models. But I do think you can retain the constituency link and expand choice, such as the Australian model, which gives local winners a degree of preference from a majority of the voters in their district through ranked choice voting. There is an excellent analysis today from Lewis Baston on Sam Friedman's website explaining how the Australian model could be appropriate for us. It's easily understood, it encourages engagement across the spectrum beyond the swing voters that otherwise become the predominant focus of elections. And while I support electoral reform for Westminster elections, I do think there's a straightforward policy change that the government should consider immediately, and that's restoring ranked choice voting system for mayoral elections. That system worked perfectly well in London and other mayoralties, allowing voters to express preferences and ensure that winners had broad support. And its removal by the previous government was a regressive and self-interested step, one in London that failed, but actively tried to reduce voter choice and participation. And I hope the government will consider restoring that system in any future elections bill that's been discussed for a future session. Finally, I'd just like to briefly address another threat to our democracy that the APPG on fair votes is focusing on, and that's the role of foreign billionaires in distorting political discourse and the risk of overseas donations into our politics. There are still far too many loopholes in our electoral financing rules that leave us vulnerable to foreign interference, and I hope the government will consider reforms to address these very serious issues in any future elections bill. Because if we're serious about defending democracy, we need transparency and safeguards over those with the deepest pockets that seek to warp our democratic institutions. Madam Deputy Speaker, our current system is failing to command public trust. That's the foundation of my belief in electoral reform. If we continue down this path, we risk losing something far greater than individual elections. We risk losing the faith of the people in democracy itself. I'm very confident that our government will deliver on its key missions, and that will go a long way to restoring trust and confidence in government. But our democratic plumbing matters too, and it's time for an upgrade.
Noah Law.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As a Member of Parliament for St Austell and Newquay, I represent a constituency that exemplifies the rich diversity and complexity of political identity in Britain. So if I may use this as a case study, a geographical case study for today's debate, from the fishing communities of Mavagissey to the supposed surfers' paradise in Newquay, but it's actually quite a multifaceted town, to the clay country villages near St Austell, many share a Cornish identity but are also shaped by a complexity of of cultural, social and economic factors, and that diversity should be reflected in our politics, but under first past the post that is often not the case. The current electoral system obscures that complexity, oversimplifies the intricate patchwork of overlapping political identities, and denies many voters the choice to express those. Too often, it functions to maintain and reinforce rigid political boundaries that do not always reflect the nuanced and diverse beliefs of our communities, entrenching social division rather than fostering the kind of constructive, consensus-building politics that we need in modern Britain and that we in Cornwall are quite used to. And yes, I give way on that point.
Can I put it to you that the opposite is the case? That our system requires coalitions to be formed. Political parties are coalitions, broad coalitions, to overcome the disadvantage and get over the electoral hurdle. In those systems, which are proportional, you can secure electoral representation and be much more choosy about your ideological base, in the expectation you will still get sufficient parliamentary representation. As a consequence, parties make their coalitions after the election, stitched up on a programme that nobody actually voted for.
Well, I think the honourable gentleman raises a very interesting point about the nature of coalition building, which takes place, as he rightly says, in both systems. But I think that coalition... I will give way again on that point.
Because would you not agree that in our current system, you vote for what can actually be a very loose coalition, because that's what our electoral system forces you to have, a very large coalition in order to form a government, but you don't know which part of that coalition you're going to get after the election under our system.
I think both members raise important points about the imperfections in all systems, and that coalition building is a feature of all such systems, which we should be mindful of. In St Austell and Newquay, my constituents are as diverse in those perspectives as they are in their daily lives. Many feel a deep-rooted connection to Cornish culture, heritage, our nationhood even. Socially and economically, they navigate very different realities. Some are tied to the rural economy, others are engaged in tourism and trade, and many have livelihoods shaped by the seasonal nature of coastal life. Others have stronger ties to the industrial economy, which is seeing a much-needed resurgence, and meaning it's in some ways long overdue that we have a Labour MP in the area. So, whilst Cornwall is in many ways a small C conservative part of Britain, we also have that shared belief in fairness, in economic justice, and the principle that hard work should be rewarded. And it's these shared values that must be reflected in our system. It's that consensus building that we do through this patchwork that should be the byproduct of a system rather than simply the goodwill and share values that we have in Cornwall. So under the current system, many voters feel that their vote fails to express those nuances. It can lead to disengagement, disillusionment, and a sense that the political system does not serve them. Moreover, the political boundaries fostered by the first past the post system make social integration more difficult, often deepening ignorance, polarisation and division. In a winner-takes-all system, it does not encourage dialogue or cooperation, sadly, but rather entrenches an adversarial style of government where short-term victories are prioritised over long-term solutions. And by contrast, a more proportionate system would ensure that political views are not distorted or diluted in the same way. It would allow for greater plurality, meaning that every vote carries more weight, and no matter where the country in the country it is cast. So moving to such a system would enhance our democracy and ensure that Parliament better represents a broad spectrum of views held by the electorate. But because I deny the primacy of first past the post, it does not mean that I think change should come overnight, or without serious discussion, or without being at the democratic will of British people. The electoral reform that we are seeking is a significant undertaking, and it must be done in a way that strengthens rather than undermines our democratic institutions. And if we truly believe that every vote matters and that fostering politics must reflect the diversity of this country, then we must be willing to have that conversation seriously. Madam Deputy Speaker, the political identity and plurality of St Austell and Newquay deserves recognition in our electoral system, and no matter their chosen industry, cultural identity or economic status, my constituents should have the confidence that their votes are representative and included in our democracy, one that acknowledges the full spectrum of views in our community.
I now call Liberal Democrat spokesperson Sarah Olney.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I begin by thanking my honourable friend, the member for Hazel Grove, the member for Leeds Central and Headingley, and all the members of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Fair Elections for their work in securing this important debate. It's been an exciting few months for the cause of fair votes in this Parliament, and I'm pleased to see members of so many different political parties advocating for proportional representation in today's debate. At the end of last year, I was delighted that a bill which I introduced to this House, which called for the establishment of proportional representation, was successfully voted through to second reading. And I thank every single member of this House who backed that bill. It is the first time ever that Parliament has voted in favour of PR, and I am determined that in this Parliament we will achieve that goal. But I must also express my disappointment. Despite the bill having received the express support of Parliament at first reading, it has not been given parliamentary time to allow it to progress through the legislative process. People across the country are fed up with first past the post. The 2024 election was the most disproportionate in history, with the government winning 2/3 of the seats on 1/3 of the vote, the second biggest majority of seats for any government since the Second World War, on the lowest share of the vote ever recorded for a winning party. I think we can all agree that such distorted results are not healthy for our democracy. So it's of no surprise that we're seeing record levels of disillusionment with the political process, with citizens becoming increasingly disengaged. This is reflected in the fact that turnout in the 2024 general election was the second lowest since 1918 at just under 60%. Over 40% of registered voters in the UK thought so little of the political process that they didn't think it worth expressing a preference for one candidate over another. Trust in politics will not improve if the public keep getting parliaments that don't represent the balance of votes cast. And this Parliament is the one that least represents how the country voted of any in history. Will she now give way on that point? I will not give way. Why? There were no backbench speeches from any member of your party, and you will have your opportunity in a minute. There are many urgent and pressing challenges facing the UK today.
Very democratic of you.
You could have spoken. Your backbenchers could have spoken in this debate. There are many urgent and pressing challenges facing the UK today, but it is essential that the vast majority of its citizens actively support the mechanisms by which the decisions are made to address them. Increasing levels of disengagement threaten our ability to respond both to immediate challenges and to long-term issues. The Liberal Democrats believe, and have always believed, that a fair voting system is an essential bedrock of a functioning democracy. Democracy has proved to be the most effective and enduring of governing systems because it relies on a broad base of support across the population. A faulty voting system, delivering a majority government on a minority vote, undermines democracy and its ability to deliver effective government. In the face of growing worldwide threats to democratic governments and institutions, the UK needs to urgently reassert the value of participative democracy as an essential component in peaceful and prosperous societies. I'm glad to know that support for electoral reform comes not only from the Liberal Democrat benches, but from across the House. And I'm pleased that Labour members in particular agree with me that we need proportional representation after voting overwhelmingly in favour of PR at their conference 2 years ago. And more importantly, recent polling shows that a majority of the British public are now in favour of scrapping first past the post and moving to proportional representation. I welcome the establishment and the work of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Fair Elections, which launched last year with the support of over 100 MPs, and their report, Free Not Fair, highlights many of the structural issues which have led to the decline of public trust in politics and engagement with elections. I just wanted to pick up a couple of the points raised in the debate. I want to thank everybody for their contributions. She's not in her place, but the member for Vauxhall and Camberwell made some important interventions, and I hope that in her role as the chair of the Select Committee for Communities and Local Government, and I think this will come under her remit, that perhaps she will consider giving this issue some more attention. I thank particularly my honourable friends from Chelmsford, from Tewkesbury, from Hazel Grove, from Didcot and Wantage, from Wokingham for their excellent contributions. I was particularly struck by my honourable friend from Wokingham when he talked about how in the past we discriminated by wealth, gender and religion when selecting people to vote, we now discriminate by geography, and that is one of the key things that we need to overcome by replacing our voting system. And I wanted to say particularly to the member for Boston and Skegness, the Liberal Democrats, we share your pain. I can tell you, in 2017, we got 7.5% of the vote, we got 12 seats. In 2019, we got 12% of the votes, and we got 11 seats. And in 2024, we got 12.2% of the vote, and we got 72 seats. And just because we happen now, by some miracle, I'll take that, of first past the post, we now have a proportion of seats that represents our proportion of votes. It does not dilute in any way our support for a more proportional voting system. And I'm glad that we have his support on that and that of his Reform UK colleagues. In conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, we must take urgent action to protect democratic processes and institutions in the UK from threats both here in the UK and abroad. We need to listen to the warning bell sounded by the general elections, that the citizens we seek to serve and who must abide by the laws we pass are becoming disenchanted with the political process. If we want to continue to be a beacon of democracy across the world, we must ensure that it serves its purpose, both in giving a voice to the people and in delivering prosperity and stability. We cannot do the latter if we fail at the first. First past the post is a broken and unfair system. This summer, the Labour Party won that landslide election victory, securing 63% of seats in the House of Commons in return for just 34% of the vote. This system leaves millions of voices unheard. It creates a divisive, adversarial political climate where collaboration is discouraged and accountability is often sidestepped. The Liberal Democrats have long championed proportional representation, advocating for a voting system where every vote truly counts. We must modernise our electoral system, creating a fairer process to engage voters, listen to the needs of constituents and rebuild trust in politics. Winning a vote in Parliament for my bill creates a historic precedent. MPs have for the first time backed a proportional voting system in the division lobbies. It would be an outrage were this bill not given the opportunity to progress further through the House and become law. So I urge the Minister to schedule an opportunity for the bill to be read for a second time in government time and offer Labour MPs a free vote on the bill. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Shadow Minister Paul Holmes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'm grateful to members on both sides of the House for their thoughtful and interesting contributions to this debate today. And can I thank the Backbench Business Committee for allocating the time to this important discussion, and thank the Honourable Gentleman for Leeds Central in introducing the debate this afternoon in the way in which he did. As a nation, it's an important discussion, and as a nation, we maybe don't recognise enough that we should be proud of the peaceful and democratic way we govern ourselves, despite our various and often heated disagreements, if you might have seen. And unlike the last member, I'm not afraid. I will give way.
Thank you, my honourable friend. It does at least show that you have some sense of knowledge of what democracy actually does mean.
Thank you. I thank the honourable lady for Tiverton and Minehead for that wonderful intervention. The Chamber should know that she and I are very good friends, and I'm not afraid, unlike the Liberal Democrat spokesman, to stand up by the courage of my convictions and the arguments that I will make in this debate and take interventions and have a genuine debate on this issue, unlike the Liberal Democrat Party. I will give way to my honourable friend.
Can I interrupt this community love fest and ask my honourable friend to reflect on the experience of Israel, where tiny religious parties are perpetually in government, exercising disproportionate influence and influencing policy in a way that is at variance with the majority's wishes.
I thank my honourable friend. He's absolutely correct. There is a vast and quite radical system that elects the Israeli government, where a number of extreme politicians on both sides, no I won't, on both sides of the aisle, or if he'll at least let me finish the point in relation to my honourable friend. Well, I haven't finished my point. I say to the honourable member, I haven't finished my point. I intend to finish it. That the electoral system in Israel elects people on extreme wings of either side of the aisle who have a disproportionate impact on the policies and the outcomes of that Israeli government. I won't at the moment. I'm going to make some progress. Over the past several years, our country has undergone a myriad of complex and contentious reforms which have revolutionised our systems of government. These changes have been made often in a piecemeal fashion over many centuries, from Simon de Montfort's Parliament of 1265, in which representatives from towns and the shires were summoned together to discuss matters of national concern, to the Great Reform Acts of 1832 and 1857, permitting the expansion of suffrage, to the Representation of the People Act in 1928, which extended the franchise to all persons, male and female, over the age of 21. These evolutionary changes have allowed us as a country to forego frequent domestic upheaval and civil wars, which are a feature of other less stable systems at the time. And I will say to honourable members across the House, I know I am in a minority of one this afternoon, apart from the honourable gentleman for member for Ilford South, but the Conservative Party has long championed first past the post as the fairest and most effective way to elect representatives, ensuring... I say to the honourable lady from a sedentary position, my colleagues in the Conservative Parliamentary Party are out in their constituencies campaigning and standing up for them, not focusing on a debate that's outdated and will never last. The Conservative Party has championed first past the post as the fairest and most effective way to elect representatives, ensuring clear accountability, stable governance and a direct link between elected officials and their constituencies. Indeed, this is even our historic and momentous defeats after our historic and momentous defeats of 1997 and 2024. But the party has continued to support first past the post, as evidenced by the submission to the Jenkins Commission in 1998, because we believe the way to win elections is to gain the trust of the public and not to gerrymander the system when things get tough. And I must say to members, voters have already shown their preference for first past the post and backed a decision by 13 million people who voted against the voting system referendum proposals in 2011. I know it's not a popular thing for opposition parties, but I believe that we should respect the results of referendums. And with 68% of people voting no, I'll just finish this point, that referendums results should be respected for at least a generation, as the honourable gentleman for the Welwyn Hatfield made in his very thoughtful contribution. Indeed, it should be noted that in 2011, alternative vote was supported by a majority of wasn't supported by a majority of local voters in a mere 10 of the 440 local counting areas. And I must say, Mr. Speaker, this debate does raise some pertinent points and questions for opposition MPs, other opposition MPs. Only 7 months after they won a resounding and historical vote in a landslide victory under the first past the post system, MPs from the Labour Party suddenly want to do away with the system that provided them with their victory in the first place. And smaller parties want to gerrymander the system because they didn't get as many seats as they wanted. Or is it, Madam Deputy Speaker, that members opposite are already struggling at having to work directly for the constituents that put them in their places, because they are suffering from the biggest and most profound instance of bias remorse since this government took office. And I say gently to the honourable member for Brighton Pavilion, who outlined that there could be a two-tier system of Member of Parliament, and that certain members could pick and choose what they would choose to focus on for their constituents. I say to her gently, members in this House under this system take on every issue for their constituents in our constituencies. They have that direct link to me in Hamble Valley, and I will not pick and choose what issues I take up, as members in this House generally don't. We stand up for our constituents on all issues that they think are important in this country and in their constituencies. And as for the Liberal Democrats, who once again, in a debate about our electoral system, are not worthy of Democrat within their name. They have once again outlined that they have an opposition to voter ID, which guarantees safe and fair voting systems in this country and stops people from being able to take votes from people that are genuinely entitled to vote in this country. And they have also outlined that they now want to gerrymander the system in order to get more votes themselves. And I'll gently say to the opposition spokesman from Richmond Park, she said that a lack of turnout meant that the results of the election were not as valid as they should be. That's a perfectly entitled and perfectly reasonable proposition. But her bill on proportional representation passed with the votes of 60 MPs in this House, 62 MPs in this House, out of a total electorate of 650 by a majority of 2. So therefore, if she takes her proposition, does that mean that her bill is less entitled to pass this House than other votes because of the turnout of MPs voting on an outdated proposition? Under proportional representation, we have a level of direct accountability which is often lost in the complexities of coalitions and backroom deals. Advocates of PR stress the need for the party share of the legislature to mirror the share of the popular vote, yet this is the wrong test. It's more important to look at the share of the vote and the share of executive power. Over time, PR leads to a highly disproportionate relationship between votes cast and the share of executive power. This is unhealthy for democracy. First past the post ensures the brutal and efficient removal of governments when ruling administrations loses power and popular support, and it is rightly booted out and replaced with a new government facilitated often by a clear mandate from voters. I will now to the Honourable.
Most generous of you. I'm most grateful. Is the Honourable Member aware that almost all other major democratic nations across the world use PR? Doesn't that prove that far from being outdated, it's contemporary?
If the Honourable Gentleman is seriously coming to this House and suggesting that just because other people do it, we should follow suit, then I really think that he needs to go away and think about his policy proposition again. This country let me finish the point. This country has elected more stable governments than most European nations under proportional representation. That is a proud and long-standing convention of this country and of this House of Commons, and that is why I suggest to members across this House that that is why the Conservative Party believes in, and that is why this House should believe in keeping first past the post as we go forward in other general elections. Oh, I'm spoilt for choice and I haven't got much time left. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady and then the Honourable Lady.
I just wondered whether the Honourable Gentleman remembered how many Prime Ministers there were between the last election we've just had and the one before, and whether voters knew what they were getting at the start of 2019.
If I could just say, I think that's a relatively lazy argument to make, because that was internal machinations of the Conservative Party and not concerned with the electoral system that we have. I will give her the point that that was not a good time within my party or within this country's period of office. But what I will say to her that is not a symbol of the electoral system for members of the public. That is about the way in which parties elect leaders. Now, in relation to proportional representation not allowing excessive parties from different wings to be elected, if we look at an example in 2009 in European elections under the PR system, the British National Party won 2 MEPs with 6% of the vote. In the very rare cases where the BNP won local government seats, such as in Barking and Dagenham in 2006, their support was 35 to 50% of the popular vote in the winning wards. First past the post, by contrast, acts as a safeguard against extremism, ensuring that only candidates with broad support can win. This helps preserve the political stability and moderation that are hallmarks of our parliamentary democracy. And when coalition governments are formed, it becomes difficult for voters to hold any one party accountable for their decisions. Blame for unpopular policies can be easily shifted between coalition partners, which, given how things are going for them, I know might be appealing for the members opposite, but it erodes trust in politics, whereas first past the post, on the other hand, provides clarity. Voters know exactly which party is in charge and can hold them to account at the next election. It is also the case that under a party-list PR system, previously the European Parliament system in Great Britain, there was no direct accountability. Representatives are dependent on a party patronage system. How many voters actually knew the name of their European Parliament members when we were in the European Union? I would hazard to know that there was only 1 or 2 well-known MEPs, and one of them is still close by. Madam Deputy Speaker, I think the choice for us is clear, although I know undoubtedly I am in the minority this afternoon. First past the post ensures strong and stable governance, clear accountability, and an electoral system that is easily understood by the public. It prevents small, unrepresentative parties from wielding disproportionate influence and upholds the direct link between MPs and their constituents. The British people have spoken in favour of first past the post, and we should respect that decision. Members of the opposition in other opposition parties should learn and take it from us that we know that you cannot keep asking the same question over and over and expect a different response. The first past the post system has served the UK well for generations. It delivers clear outcomes, stable governments and a direct link between voters and their representatives. If we were to move to a PR regional-based system, that link will be lost and MPs would be scrambling and fighting to take on casework of their constituents. You can just imagine the mafioso-style turf wars such a system would generate to scrap those sensible and time-honoured demarcations that would be terrifically reckless and fundamentally unnecessary and do our electors a disservice. We should not trade a proven system for one that prioritises theoretical fairness over practical effectiveness. The challenges we face as a country demand strong leadership, clear accountability and a system that works for the people. And even though I do not like the result, the Labour government won that mandate under the system we have. First past the post has provided that government. We should stick to that system and allow the British people to have a system that they fundamentally understand and fundamentally believe in.
The Honourable Member for Hamble Valley, in his wide-ranging comments, talked about the vote that was held on the 3rd of December 2024 relating to the election's proportional representation 10-minute rule motion. He mentioned rightly that the ayes to the right won by 2 votes, but in fact the number of votes cast were 138 ayes and 136 noes. He mentioned that there were only 62 votes cast, and I'm sure he would like to correct the record.
That is a point of debate, not a point of order. Shadow Minister.
Point of order, Madam Deputy Speaker. I am perfectly willing to correct the record and apologise to the House. However, what I would say is that was still a minority of the 50% that would be required under the system that they're advocating.
Order. I now call the Minister, Rushanara Ali.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to start off by thanking my honourable friend, the member for Leeds and Headingley, for opening this debate, and congratulate the Backbench Business Committee and the key members for securing this debate. The UK's democratic system and institutions are strong and rightly held the world over as a strong example of democracy. I know this because as someone who was born in another country, it is a democracy, a democratic system that has provided inspiration, albeit we have, as today we've heard from many honourable members, some of the areas where they believe that more work needs to be done. But we are in defence of our democratic system, Madam Deputy Speaker. I just want to reiterate how much our system is cherished, our democracy is cherished, and whichever side of the argument members are in, it's vital that we work tirelessly to protect our democracy that does face different kinds of threats in the current climate. And I hope in that endeavour we will all work together to make sure that we protect the integrity of our system, our institutions and our democracy, our precious democracy. Madam Deputy Speaker, how we select our representatives in Parliament is of fundamental importance, and members quite rightly have strong views. The choice of voting systems is central to that concern, as we've heard in the many speeches that have been made today. And how those votes are cast goes to the heart of our democracy. And I, for one, am incredibly proud of the fact that when I first was elected in 2010, the first person of British Bangladeshi heritage, the fact that I got a democratic mandate under the system, our system, as it was, as it is a source of great pride. It is that democratic mandate must never be delegitimised, even if we believe that there should be a different system. And my plea to all members whatever their arguments, whichever side of the argument, whichever system they believe that we should be adopting, or whether we believe we should retain this system, it's absolutely vital that we do not delegitimise the democratic mandate that this government or any other government in the past has won an election on to serve in this country, to serve the people that have voted for us in their interest. I give way to the Honourable Member.
I'd like to thank the Honourable Lady. I think she's making an important point. I think she's making a broader important point about the individual mandate that individual MPs also feel when they are elected to this place. And does she agree with me that that individual mandate, because it's our individual names on the ballot paper, is strengthened under the first past the post system, but it also means that our electorate can also single out individual MPs, which could not happen under a party list system, in order to remove them?
I thank the Honourable Member for the contribution he's made, and he makes a really important point about the importance of the constituency connection with Members of Parliament. And Honourable Members have made very important contributions about an alternative system, other systems, and the merits as well as limitations. Each of those systems has its pros and cons. Of course, that was very strongly, powerfully debated by many honourable members today. And I respect these strongly held views in relation to the nature, the subject matter for this debate on electoral reform. Madam Deputy Speaker, at this time, I know colleagues will be disappointed. At this time, and I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, where there's been such a general loving in this debate across parties, but bar some exceptions, this government has no plans to change the voting system for elections to the House of Commons. I'm getting unlikely cheers. I'm not used to having cheers from the opposition, the main opposition party. The first past the post system, while not perfect, provides for, as has been pointing it out, a direct relationship between members of Parliament and their local constituency. And such a change would require a national conversation and a referendum. This government's focus and number one priority, Madam Deputy Speaker, having won the general election with the mandate that we have secured, is to make sure that we kickstart our economy, we create the growth that is desperately needed, we improve living standards, we improve our NHS, we improve our public services to serve the people of our country. Madam Deputy Speaker, members have put their arguments across eloquently, and I respect those arguments. And I just want to point out, of course, as others have done, that we did have the opportunity in 2011 in that referendum. Unfortunately, that for those who are proponents, that referendum was lost. Madam Deputy Speaker, the processes that underpin our elections are of paramount importance, and changes cannot be made lightly. However, I would stress that we are not averse to changes and innovation to our democracy. We must continue to monitor all aspects of our electoral system and ensure that it runs effectively and adapts to the modern challenges that we face as a democracy. And as we've set out in our manifesto, there are changes we are seeking to bring forward on this matter, including our commitment to extending the franchise to 16 and 17-year-olds. We are also continuing to assess the voter identification policy in order to address any inconsistencies, and I'm pleased that last year we were able to add the veteran card to the list of accepted documents, and other veteran community, and our veteran community will be able to now use these to vote at the polling stations for May this year. We are continuing to consider if further improvements to policy can be made, and I'm conscious of the contributions some honourable members have made about the exclusion of legitimate voters. It's crucial that we make sure that people are not disenfranchised while ensuring that there aren't abuses of our system. Madam Deputy Speaker, as I mentioned, in 2011, the AV referendum took place when the then Liberal Democrat Party, in coalition with the Conservative Party, secured that referendum. And there was considerable cross-party support with members on my side of the House, and the proposal was rejected by 67.9% of votes. While I recognise the strength of feeling, I've made clear the current government's position. Honourable members have raised the important point that they have raised about whether this government has any plans for a national commission for electoral reform. At present, it does not. But however, it's not a Freudian slip. At present, it doesn't. Some honourable members have raised the point about whether the government, on the point in relation to the London mayor election, PCCs following the change in 2022 under the Election Act. The government currently has no plans to change the voting system for these polls at this time. And like a number of policies, we will keep these matters under review. Madam Deputy Speaker, a number of honourable members have mentioned the point about turnout and have suggested that the first-past-the-post system is contributing to a decrease in turnout and pointing out the low turnout in the last election. Members will know that turnout can vary for a range of different factors, and it's on all of us to think carefully. Let me finish my sentence and I'll give it. Think carefully about the drivers for low turnout, which will be a range of factors that we all have a responsibility as members, elected representatives, working with our parties, with our communities, to promote engagement and make sure, particularly young people, and we will work with colleagues to make sure that we promote that engagement, democratic engagement, and ensure that young citizens are active citizens. We have to make sure that happens from an early age. I'm going to address one other point, given the time, and I want to leave time for a final response from the closer of the debate. Madam Deputy Speaker, my honourable friend, the member for Kensington and Bayswater, raised the point about foreign finance and foreign interference in relation to funding. Foreign money has no place in UK politics, and it is vital we protect our democracy from those who seek to interfere in the UK elections through illegitimate political donations. That is why we committed in our manifesto to strengthen the rules around donations to political parties, and we will work with members across the House to make sure we protect the integrity of our democracy. I will briefly give way to the honourable member, but he'll have to be quick.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I would invite the Minister to join the APPG for fair elections, where she will see that there is a very clear correspondence between first past the post and the lack of engagement over time.
I thank the honourable member for his invitation, and I welcome him to send in information to the. He knows that I can't be a member of the all-party group, but I recognise and commend the work of the all-party group, having been a member and chaired many all-party groups in my 14 years of life in opposition, and recognise the importance of the work that all-party groups can do. In conclusion, Madam Speaker, Deputy Speaker, I want to thank my honourable friends and honourable members across the House for this debate and for their important contributions. Strongly held views, deeply held views about a really important subject about the future of our democracy, nature of our democracy. And going forward, I think it's vital, whichever side of the argument we are on, that we always maintain our commitment to working together to protect our democracy and make sure we work tirelessly to strengthen our democracy. Thank you.
Alex Sobel to wind up.
I'll be very brief because we've had a long and actually very thorough debate. I'd like to thank everybody who's taken part in the debate, actually particularly the member for Ilford South, because he cut a lonely figure in opposing the proposition today, but to thank him for his bravery against such opposition. It's a shame we couldn't have had more parties speak against the proposition, as we had so many speaking in favour. I'd like to thank the Minister for committing to work with the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Fair Elections, which I chair, and I'll be following up on that. But I want to just make one substantive point, because I feel that there is maybe a lack of understanding about one thing. We did have a referendum on the alternative vote system in 2011. I'm very well aware of that referendum. The alternative vote system, which is used in Australia to elect the Australian Parliament, is a preferential system, not a proportional system. So we've had a referendum on preferential representation, but we have never had a referendum on proportional representation. I do not see why we need to wait a generation, as the Shadow Minister suggested, because we haven't had. And I certainly do not think that we need to have a referendum on a preferential system. But we do need to further consider, as I've laid out in this debate, a commission to look at the failures in our electoral system and to look at whether we should move to a more proportional system. Thank you.
The question is, as on the order paper, as many as are of that opinion say aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. I'll now give a few moments for the front benches to swap over.